Welcome everybody. My name is Kevin Kenny. I serve as director of Glucksman Ireland House. This is our second Zoom event of the semester. I want to announce one other. Friday, October 7th at 2 p.m. Our own Sarah Wadler will host a roundtable on the formation of identity in medieval Ireland. And after that, all going well, we plan to finally reopen our doors to the public for the first time in 2.5 years. On October 13th at 7 p.m., Dr. James Stafford of Columbia University will give a public lecture here in Ireland House, Sovereignty and Commerce, the Case of Ireland, to mark the publication of his important new book on that subject. So today, as the moderator of our event, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Peter Hession, who has recently joined NYU as a faculty fellow in Irish history here at Glucksman Ireland House. Graduate of Trinity College Dublin, Peter completed his PhD from Cambridge and subsequently held teaching and research positions at the Irish College in Paris, Universities of Leicester and Liverpool, and University College Dublin. Peter is currently secretary of the Society for the Study of 19th Century Ireland, and together with Aidan Beattie, he recently co-edited a special issue of Radical History Review entitled Irish and World Histories, which includes several of today's panelists. We're delighted that Peter has joined our faculty and that he is hosting our event today. Peter will be joined by Dr. Kerron Ó Luain, who will talk about internationalist perspectives on Irish language history, Dr. Aoife O'Leary McNeice, talking about transnational approaches to hunger and humanitarianism, Professor Kenneth Shonk on Irish diplomacy and the Global South, Dr. José Brownrigg Gleeson on the global history of revolution in Ireland and South America, and Dr. Sophie Cooper on new Irish diaspora histories. So just to explain the format of our event, Peter will introduce the speakers, each of whom will briefly discuss their contribution. And then Peter will take questions from the audience. Urge you to feel free to post comments and questions in chat along the way or after the speakers have finished. Do so at any time. Peter will then pose your questions to our panelists. Our program will run until about 1:45. So thanks everyone, and over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for the very kind introduction there, and thanks to Glucksman Ireland House for generously hosting this afternoon's proceedings as well. Well, as Kevin mentioned, the inspiration for today's event was the special issue that I was recently involved in co-editing. But I really think it's fair to say, and it's very much evidenced by the varied lineup that we have here joining us today, that the global turn, or global turns, plural, is indeed something that has been happening, I think, for quite some time now, right across the field of Irish historiography and indeed across the broader interdisciplinary field of Irish studies more generally. And for my own part, I think it's something I have come to really value and embrace, because as I see it, and I'm sure my panelists would broadly agree with this, I feel that Irish history has next to nothing to lose, and in fact a very, very great deal to gain from breaking the mold of a narrowly defined kind of nation state perspective, be that a kind of 26 county or an island-centric perspective, or indeed, I think more commonly in Irish historiography, a sort of Anglo-centric, straight-jacketed view of the Irish past. In a word, I think this is because breaking this mold so often leads us in intellectually exciting and often also very pressing directions in terms of the contemporary world that we live in. I think this is because in doing so, we begin to capture those historical processes, which actually give the Irish experience a much wider sort of relevance and valency in the world of today, as much as in the world of the past. I think this is true of widening our view of Ireland and the Irish, you know, in terms of, you name it. I mean, the first thing most of us will think of is migration, of course. But we can also think about this in terms of ecologies, which are transnational, which go beyond borders. Think about it in terms of the experience of empire and colonialism, of systems of capitalism and other economic systems, and so on and so forth. Irish history, I think, not only becomes more interesting and more relevant, but it also becomes crucially more critical, I think, in this process of moving away from an island and a kind of state-centric narrative that has, I think, for so long often replicated, in fact, consciously or unconsciously, the conservative forms of the Irish state and aspects of Irish society itself. So I think there is really an inherent radicalism, arguably, certainly a freshness and a creativity and an intellectual self-confidence to this emerging chorus of new perspectives, or indeed a kind of variety of new perspectives. And there's a variety of different approaches here. We can think about comparative history, holding the Irish experience in tension with historical processes in other times and places. Transnational history, as I mentioned, focusing on flows of people, goods, or ideas across and back and forth through borders over history, or indeed world or kind of global framings of different aspects of Ireland's past in terms of structures and systems that naturally they transcend the borders of a given nation or state. And on that note, I really can't think of a better way to convey, I suppose, the richness and promise of what is happening in Irish history right now, and then to turn to the very distinguished lineup of speakers who have very kindly agreed to join us today to speak about how their own quite, I think, diverse research agendas engage with different and various global turns in Irish history today. So without further ado, I will introduce the speakers, beginning with Dr. Kerron Ó Luain, who is an Irish Research Council Enterprise Partnership Scheme Fellow at Dublin City University. Kerron's postdoctoral research examines through oral accounts and digital mapping the history of the Gaelscoil movement in Ireland over the past 50 years. He's interested in the historical process of cultural decolonisation and what might be learned from those or from these movements, which can be kind of reapplied to the present day. Dr. Sophie Cooper is a lecturer in liberal arts at Queen's University Belfast. Before joining Queen's, Sophie was a teaching fellow in Irish history at the University of Leicester. She's a social and cultural historian of gender, migration, and public space in Ireland and the wider world. And I should mention that her first monograph, Forging Identities in the Irish World, Melbourne and Chicago, 1830 to 1922, is out now with Edinburgh University Press. Dr. Aoife O'Leary McNeice holds her PhD from the University of Cambridge and has held a Scolaudi Fellowship at the Institute of Historical Research in London. Her doctoral dissertation concerns networks of global humanitarianism and the Great Irish Famine, and her wider research interests include Ireland, empire, humanitarian, inequality, class, and gender as well. Dr. Kenneth Shonk is Professor of History and Social Studies Education and Chair of the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. His recent publications include Ireland's New Traditionalists, Fianna Fáil, Republicanism and Gender, 1926 to 1938, out with Cork University Press last year, and Historical Theory and Methods Through Popular Music, which he co-authored with Daniel McClure out in 2017. And finally, we have Dr. José Brownrigg Gleeson, who recently completed an Irish Research Council Government of Ireland postdoctoral fellowship at the National University of Ireland, Galway. He formerly held a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship at the University of Notre Dame, Keogh Nocton Institute for Irish Studies. He has written on Irish migration, mobility, and multilingualism in Spanish America, and is currently completing his monograph study about Irish interactions with the Hispanic world during the Age of Revolutions. So welcome to all of our panelists. And without further ado, I will hand over to Kerron to get us off to a good start. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Kevin and Glucksman House for the invite. So as Peter mentioned, I looked at the history of the Gaelscoil movement, which is essentially a movement of Irish medium schools. And I look at them really through the frame of decolonisation. you can identify two sort of key strands as to why they come to the fore in the 1970s, really. There's a long-term ideology, which a lot of you will be familiar with, in terms of language revitalisation, going back to Conradh na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League and so forth, and that influences them. But really, in terms of a global turn, what I did was I applied some of the sort of the lens which Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci looked at, the changes in the mode of production. So what are the key drivers in the economy, and how do they, when they change, they bring forth new sort of subaltern groups or groups who are oppressed, and what sort of actions do these groups use? So in terms of the 26 counties in the 1970s, the processes that the likes of T.K. Whitaker used are set in train really in 1958. He was the chief sort of economist at the time in the state, moved the economy of the state from a sort of primarily agricultural rural economy into a more sort of globalized and multinational driven economy based on big pharma and technology and so forth. So that creates this context for the Gaelscoileanna to emerge, because it really it sets about urbanization. Suburbia in particular grows. There's a new upward and upwardly mobile working class and middle class in particular, and they're living in new communities. Well, what happens, like on the other hand, is that this new globalization creates a pressure on the Irish language, because there's a drive towards homogenization. So really, that's when they start to found Gaelscoileanna. And I traced that through, though not in the article for Radical History Review, I traced that sort of question in the mode of production through my research for the forthcoming book. So today, although the mode of production is the same, or the main emphasis on it is anyway foreign direct investment, the state sort of hinders the growth of the Gaelscoileanna, the decolonial Gaelscoileanna movement through focusing on a developer-led policy, really, in terms of housing and economy and so forth. So the work-life balance that was able to initiate the voluntary surge that brought the Gaelscoileanna to the fore doesn't exist anymore. Neither does the sort of housing, the fact that new communities came to the fore. There's no longer schools being established voluntarily. The second thing I looked at was this question of the subaltern, as I mentioned, and sort of the global links there with India, or the sort of really the subaltern studies group that was founded by Ranajit Guha and people like Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. They wrote about this question of Indian historiography being dominated by elitism, colonial elitism on the one hand, or bourgeois nationalist elitism. So what I did was look at what they had laid out, a sort of schema, if you like, for how to analyse colonised societies, particularly through a cultural lens. So there was sort of four main groups that they looked at: a dominant global group, a dominant indigenous group, a buffer group, and at the bottom the subaltern, those who were sort of doubly colonized or doubly oppressed. And the relationship between this buffer group and the subaltern are interesting because really you have Irish speakers who belong to both of those groups, and even group two, and they'll sort of, the dynamics between them are important in sort of disentangling the class dynamics of the Gaelscoil movement and the Irish language movement more broadly. I suppose, around the question of the language going back into the 20th century and the global turn, there's an interesting sort of argument being put forward by Ralston and McVeigh in their recent book, Initial Hopton Theory, The Unfinished Revolution. Really, they talk about the links with the third world being broken, and these decolonial links that I want to sort of investigate further, and that the publication sort of drove me to investigate. They talk about, during the counter-revolution in the 1920s, how the potential for a link between Ireland and the Third World was essentially broken when Ireland, the Free State, became a white dominion. So I would be asking the question through this sort of research about how to revitalise a minority language through, you know, empowering communities and improving material circumstances for those communities, and also improving education for those communities. How can we build a sort of these global links, these decolonial links through looking at history, and maybe integrating things like history and language? It's sort of funny, I suppose, in Irish universities, there's no sort of link between Irish language departments and history departments, really. They sort of operate in silos, even though if they were combined, you get a whole new perspective. Neither is there a sort of decolonial institute or these sort of networks within Ireland. I think within the 26 counties anyway, it was thought that the job was done when sort of Victoria was removed from the grounds. Queen Victoria, the statue, was removed from the grounds at Leinster House, and the post boxes were painted green. But African scholars actually have a far deeper understanding of decolonising the mind, and how this links into language, and how ideology links in with material, the continued sort of exploitation of a comprador class in these countries. So I would just point to those sort of links that could be expanded through maybe linking institutes with other formerly colonised and colonised countries. And I do that through looking at the Gael School movement.
Thank you very much, Kerron. Thanks very much. Yeah. Turning now to Sophie Cooper. Sophie, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I was just frantically scribbling because I just had a very interesting discussion with students in Belfast about painting postboxes green and different views on that. So exciting. So yeah, thanks for having me to speak about new diaspora histories and meanings, opportunities and challenges that global turns present for Irish history. I want to focus on two main things. Firstly, the research opportunities presented by pursuing diaspora histories. And obviously, new diaspora has numerous meanings, especially speaking about kind of the new diasporas within Ireland as well. But I am going to focus on the Irish diaspora going out. And secondly, a brief reflection on the ways that the mobility of the academic profession today is and can be reflected in the histories that we're studying and the questions that we're asking. So I'm mainly going to focus on the opportunities, but I'm happy to delve into the challenges and meanings in the wider discussion. So many of the methodologies that PhD students, early career researchers, and established scholars are using to research the diaspora are not new. From Kirby Miller in the 80s, and crucially from the great work being done in the first decade of the 2000s. We only need to look at the 2006 Irish Economic and Social History Forum by Kevin, John McCreld and Enda Delaney to see this. But I want to draw attention to some of what's being done now and how. And part of what is prompting new questions comes from moving across disciplines, across national or ethnic boundaries and identities, and across research silos. In my own research, comparing Irish communities in Melbourne and Chicago, and I do have my book here, very exciting, within and out with the British Empire, has allowed for different interrogations of power structures at international, national, and local levels. And also how these kind of different levels of power were negotiated at different times and depending on who you were. I really think these comparisons across different colonial structures, including those outside of formal empires, can and has led to lots of productive research, and there's so much more going on now. Until recently, the histories of the Irish diaspora have been very male-focused. Jennifer Redmond, in her superb Moving Histories, notes that there's been a tradition of Irish diaspora history, which is actually male Irish diaspora history, but it's just been named diaspora history. Those who did write about Irish women have tended to write within fields of religious history or education history. And this separation of historical fields, often separated again based on class and national boundaries, has been reflected in our understandings of who and what the Irish diaspora is or was, and also the development of Irish history, how women were seen within Ireland in the 19th and early 20th century versus how their sisters, aunts and daughters were seen in the diaspora. Often this is kind of put as a dichotomy, whereas there are strands of agency that kind of cross all of this. As the Irish diaspora is increasingly studied by those based outside of Ireland, and particularly outside of departments with an emphasis on Irish history, there's an infusion of cross-disciplinarity and cross-field discussion, particularly surrounding theoretical approaches, as we've seen in Twitter spats over the last few years. And I do think this could be done more, not the Twitter spats, while special issues of journals like Pete mentioned, like Radical History Review, have encouraged comparisons of Irish diaspora history, there's still a lack of diaspora-focused research being published in nationally focused journals. And this is as much about who's submitting to the journals as what is accepted, but I do think it creates extra separation. Different access to archives is just one way that new questions about Ireland are prompted. For myself, there's been a bit more freedom in access to archives of religious orders in the United States than in Ireland. And obviously this depends on what you're researching. But discussions that I've had with archivists based outside of Ireland have shifted the question that I've asked of archives and archivists in Ireland and vice versa. So I have an article on Limerick lace veils and female promotion of Irish identity in Australia. This was partly after being in the huge collections of clothing held by the Sisters of Mercy in North Carolina and seeing a passing comment in a digitised Australian newspaper. Letters about pension claims led me to research nuns during the Irish Revolutionary era in Ireland and the diaspora and the ongoing connections between the two. I briefly want to move on to my second point, which is the mobility of the profession today. A frequent job question in job interviews that I've had is about the relevancy of Irish history to students based outside of Ireland. As there are fewer Irish history jobs, early career scholars are selling Irish history to British history jobs, Irish history, US history, global or imperial colonial history jobs, or in my case, liberal arts. We're increasingly placing Irish history and diasporic communities into wider contexts. And obviously, I think that is great. It forces us to think comparatively and or transnationally, placing Irish Americans alongside German Americans, as Regina Donlan does so well, or within that radical and nationalist networks as Niamh Coffey, Niall Whelan, Jimmy Yan, many others do. Quantitative approaches to lifestyle research prompted Beth Kitson's recent PhD into aging and Irish female immigrant life cycles in the US. The growth of the job market in Korea, China, and elsewhere in Asia has led to Lachlan Sweeney's work on Irish networks in Asian port cities, while questions around the power of the archive or being based in non-history departments has facilitated great work on artistic and architectural networks. These are but a few of many, many examples. I personally came into Irish history through an American immigration module during my undergraduate degree. And for many of us who did most of their education outside of Ireland, that will be our way in. As more students come into contact with Irish history and the histories of Ireland's emigrants, we'll happily get more insights and comparisons, taking advantage of different familial or linguistic backgrounds to further our collective knowledge. The placing of Irish diaspora history into modules on race and ethnicity leads to important discussions around whiteness and power, particularly important for contextualizing the findings of recent government and non-government reports into, for example, how biracial children were treated in Ireland's institutions. The recent Redress collection brilliantly places discussions of Ireland's institutions next to those of residential schools in North America and Australia. So current debates are forcing these comparisons for ourselves and for our students, and I do think we need to kind of lean into that. So the disciplinary, geographic and epistemic mobility of scholars of Irish history and Irish diaspora history allows for kind of a bungee cord approach to research. For myself, my research into Ireland and its diasporas has allowed me to move between different hubs, moving between a focus on Irish community life in Chicago or Melbourne, and in comparison with each other, and then bringing some of the findings back to the study of life in Ireland, then back out again, building on each other, shifting the questions, and allowing a fluidity in angles that I look at things from. This suits my slightly magpie approach to things, but it also suits the research that I can afford to do, that I want to do, the availability of the primary sources I want to work with, and it suits the teaching that I'm doing and have done. So yeah, just a few thoughts.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Loads to think about there. Moving on now to Aoife O'Leary McNeice. Aoife, over to you.
Thanks. And yeah, I'd love to echo what Sophie and Kerron said. Thank you for, it's great to be part of this event. And similarly, I was scribbling down loads of notes just there in the past two speakers, because there's just so much resonance with my own work. And I think that there's loads of synergy between all of us, which is great. So yeah, today I'm just going to reflect on what I think that we can learn about famine humanitarianism by sort of combining a local and a global frame of reference. So I think the global nature of the Irish famine has at this stage been quite well established. Historians like Enda Delaney, who Sophie also mentioned, have kind of identified the famine as the world's first modern humanitarian crisis. It played out in newspapers for a global audience of strangers, many of whom were moved to donate to fundraising campaigns. And contributions to voluntary relief reached up to £2 million during the famine. And there are kind of several celebrated moments of giving that remain really fondly remembered to this day. And I'm sure that some of you will be familiar with these. They include, for example, the donation of the Choctaw Nation, who had so recently endured the dispossession of their land and the Trail of Tears. And famine relief also reveals Ireland's position within multiple kind of overlapping global networks, like the British Empire, the Catholic Church, or the Irish diaspora, or diasporas. And my research looks at how these networks were adapted to provide relief. Commercial shipping lanes became humanitarian channels, carrying news of the famine overseas and then relief in food and clothing back to Ireland. But what I really wanted to do in my research was to kind of assess how successful these campaigns were. I wanted to trace the trajectories of relief from the moment of donation to the sourcing of aid to the eventual distribution of that relief. And what I found was, despite this huge global mobilization of people and money, voluntary relief failed to meaningfully address the suffering of famine victims. So my main research question became why? Why was it easier to transport rice from Maharashtra in India to Cork Harbour than it was to get that rice to the people who needed it in Belmullet in County Mayo, for example? And I think the answer to this question reveals the sort of interplay between local and global dynamics that kind of characterize the story of famine relief. Often really hyper-local conditions impacted upon the success of relief, but these conditions in turn were influenced by global forces of trade, economics, and governance. So I kind of used two sort of overlapping categories to explore the failure of this relief: material reasons or categories and ideological ones. And these two categories are also linked. So in terms of the kind of material factors, the physical and social infrastructure didn't exist in many places in Ireland to sort of enable the transfer and distribution of this relief. The areas of Ireland that were severely impacted by the famine were often remote, overpopulated rural regions where people were very reliant on the potato and they didn't have that many sort of economic or trade connections to larger towns or cities. But this hadn't always been the case. So places like Belmullet on the west coast had successful kind of linen cottage industries and fishing industries in the early 19th century, but they became more economically isolated as the century progressed. So the factory weaving sort of wiped out cottage industries, wealthier inhabitants left these areas, and those who remained became sort of more economically and socially isolated. So that kind of links this sort of physical kind of isolation or physical infrastructure to this idea of social isolation. And often the social infrastructure of an area really defined how it would fare during the famine. So for example, I studied two towns in Waterford that were only 30 kilometres away from each other, but fared very differently during the famine. In Dunmahin, members of the community established a relief committee and set up a soup kitchen. Whereas in Dunmahin, the residents were solely reliant upon the kind of coercive, inadequate, and cruel government public works schemes. And this issue of social infrastructure touches upon the sort of ideological reasons why famine relief failed. Most of the charitable groups I studied didn't really have a proper understanding of Ireland, and they relied on a model of relief whereby local dignitaries like landlords, magistrates, or members of the clergy were the only people kind of trusted to distribute relief. So these are the people in Dunmore who had established that soup kitchen, for example. But many of the most distressed areas in Ireland had absentee landlords, they maybe didn't have access to a priest, or in general, there was kind of few wealthy inhabitants, or else these inhabitants like just didn't really want to help. So these kind of really local socioeconomic dynamics defined the success or otherwise of famine relief. This was an approach that relied often on social structures that didn't exist in many parts of the country. And I think this limited ideological approach can kind of be understood by exploring where these ideas came from. So kind of really broadly speaking, these relief strategies were informed by global trends. They are formulated by social reformers, urban philanthropists, and imperial humanitarians who largely lived outside of Ireland, or at least outside of rural Ireland. And voluntary relief schemes are often adapted from models of relief that have been designed to tackle urban poverty. They borrowed from the techniques of evangelical missionary campaigns and from the strategies of the abolitionist movement. And this kind of combined in relief efforts, which were often conditional, coercive, and overall were quite inadequate. And the degree of failure was often influenced by the degree of knowledge or lack of knowledge that various philanthropists had of Ireland. So I studied like speculative schemes about kind of land reclamation that imperial industrialists put forward, who were kind of seeking to adapt models they developed in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And these were just completely outright failures. But then I also looked at more poignant failures of groups like the Quaker-run Central Relief Committee, whose members had devoted kind of years to studying Ireland's economic and social condition, and kind of almost knew from the outset really that their efforts would be in vain. So I think understanding the global nature of the famine is really crucial in understanding the failure of famine humanitarianism. It wasn't designed to address the specific challenges of famine relief, but sort of borrowed various strategies from concurrent global campaigns. And ultimately, of course, it's impossible to solve this sort of huge structural problem of massive inequality by essentially sort of relying on what were the engines of that inequality. Humanitarian relief was built upon the infrastructure of global trade and empire. It wasn't addressing the structural causes of the famine, but rather sort of responding inadequately to the symptoms in a way. And all of these groups are, of course, playing catch up in a way that many organizations today are also forced to do in response to man-made humanitarian crises. So I think placing the famine in a global frame actually also provides insights into modern humanitarianism. But given that I think I've probably spoken for long enough, that's maybe a conversation for another day. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Aoife. Really fascinating stuff. Hand over to Kenneth Shonk now.
Thank you, Peter. And thanks to all of those in attendance and to my very esteemed colleagues on the panel. My project or article is from the Radical History Review is part of a larger project that I've called the Shadow Metropole. And it's part of my effort to make Irish history relevant to a larger audience outside of those involved with Irish or British studies. That's especially acute here in America, where Irish studies is becoming more and more marginalized and offered at fewer and fewer institutions. And this project is moving along at a glacial pace, largely because of the fact I teach at a university that offers almost no support for research. But nonetheless, the project is based on this idea that Ireland in the period from mid to late 1930s up until the 1970s, the end date is a little fluid, that Ireland and Dublin were places where anti-colonial movements, anti-colonial intellectuals could utilize the space and knowledge of Irish history and of Ireland as a means to conceptualize or justify their own movements toward independence. And their alignment with Irish history and Irish leaders was done not because Ireland really had anything that they could offer to nationalist leaders in the global South and beyond, but rather there's this sort of level of cachet and recognition by situating themselves alongside living members of the extended global Irish Revolution. And so between 1937 is so far my starting point, and that begins with the Korean composer Ik Tae-an, who on a world tour because he was exiled from Korea by the Japanese. He went on a world tour: Berlin, London, Paris, New York, etc. Made a stop in Dublin, where he performed a special patriotic song that he called the Eguka, alongside the Irish Symphony. And he debuted it there because he argued that the Irish audience would be the only one that could understand the themes of his music, of freedom and the desire for freedom. And that song is now the national anthem of South Korea. Moving forward into the 40s and 50s, you have leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who really is much like many others who came to Ireland, who took a special side trip from London to come to Dublin. And in the case of Nkrumah, he came to Dublin because he wanted to meet Eamon de Valera, who he said, like him, were prison graduates, that they learned, they went to the same college, that he also said that the problems of Ghana and the fight for independence mimics what Ireland had gone through before. U Thant, the Burmese nationalist and later Secretary General of the UN, said that he was inspired to become a nationalist by reading a biography on De Valera that was translated into Burmese. And other leaders came to Ireland to pose for pictures, to meet with De Valera, Sean Lemass, and others. And in some cases, they came to Ireland in the hopes that the Irish would lend their support or even their leadership to certain movements. The representatives of the non-aligned movement came to Ireland and asked if Ireland would be part of that movement and offer their leadership because of what they did, not in 1916 or 1919 to 1921, but what they did from 1937 on. And so there's a sense that this is an extension, as I said, of the global Irish Revolution into more modern periods. And so you have, there's also, there was an effort to create a pan-Celtic nation that Ireland would lead, of the Welsh, Scots, Manx, and Breton, amongst others. And we have leaders coming from the British, the French, the Dutch, the Japanese, and the American empires. And what I argue in this is that they're engaging in something of a shadow extroversion, and that they're viewing Ireland as a model or exemplar for nation building, from the machinations of government, economy, housing, politics. Burma sent a group over to study the Irish Constitution, and basically just crossed out Ireland and wrote Burma, crossed out Catholic Church and put in others. And this is distinct from the mimesis of former nations who are copying aspects of the British and French empires, that they're looking to Ireland as a different example. So indeed, it's very much a first of the small nations. And so the project is looking at how we can reconsider Ireland's place in the narrative of global decolonization. Because if we look at what people are saying, and I'm talking between 3-4 dozen different nations and movements are coming to Ireland to say what we're doing is mimicking you. And this is not to say that people of those nations needed Ireland to teach them how to do it, but rather it's part of this global process that they saw themselves as a part of. Now, this runs counter to the way that Ireland was viewing itself after World War II, that Ireland was viewing itself more and more as a European nation, burgeoning member of the EEC, and also working on normalizing relations with Great Britain. And so we have this cross current of people embracing Ireland's past at the same time that Ireland is moving away from its past. And the documents that I'm looking at for this project include things from the Department of Foreign Affairs, newspapers, obviously, but within those Department of Foreign Affairs documents, you see this real tension amongst the Irish about how they should interact and how they should engage with leaders from other countries, lest they might upset that relationship to the European economic community and their status as a European, dare I say, white nation. And so the project is looking at these cross currents and really trying to find networks of interaction that were recognized and built, but have largely been unstudied up to this point. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kenneth. Fascinating stuff. Again, Just before I hand over to our final speaker, Jose, I'll just remind people that use the chat for questions if you're thinking of assembling your questions. Okay, over to you, Jose.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Peter, so much for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be here with you all, and I'm very grateful, of course, to Glucksman Ireland House for putting this together. And thanks, of course, to all my co-panelists. You've got my head just buzzing with ideas at this stage. So currently, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Salamanca in Spain, where I conduct a project that examines the role of Latin America in the development of Irish perceptions of empire, slavery, and republicanism from the last quarter of the 18th century up to the 1830s or so. Essentially, my research interrogates how Ireland and Irish diaspora communities in the Americas experienced, reacted to, and also, of course, participated in the processes unleashed in the Iberian Atlantic during the so-called Age of Revolutions. Up to now, I've concentrated most of all, as in that article in Radical History Review, on understanding the development of different Irish interpretations of the independence movements, showing how support for the South American patriots was overwhelming, yes, but took on many and sometimes opposing forms. I'm also looking at the place of the Hispanic world in the circulation of counter-revolutionary discourse and practices amongst the Irish. I'm really interested, for instance, in the responses of Irish slaveholding groups in Spanish America, who owed much of their socioeconomic standing precisely to the imperial structure of the Catholic monarchy. So I say this to highlight two aspects. First, that currently I carry out my research not just from outside Ireland, but also from a professional and social environment, which is not part of the Anglosphere, with everything, good and bad, I suppose, that entails. And secondly, and even more importantly, that I've come to Irish history in a formative sense, in historiographical terms, from abroad, from the outside. For all practical purposes, this means that I'm primarily a historian of Latin America, looking from there into what was at once an imperial periphery and a colonial center in Europe. So in the context of this discussion, I think one of the main things the global turn implies for me is a shift in perspective. It is approaching Ireland and Irish history from the opposite and southern part of the Atlantic. Now, having said this, it's also perhaps time to confess that I am still not all that comfortable with terming anything in my work global. And perhaps this in itself is symptomatic of me sharing the reservations of many Spanish-speaking colleagues when it comes to the use of that label, which often comes across as a way Euro-American academia has found to try to standardize the South, the global South. What I am confident about is the need to continue to incorporate the study of Ireland and Irish communities abroad during this period into larger processes of trans-regional and cross-border connections. So this global turn for me implies, as also Sophie was speaking, a series of reconfigurations, and with them, I argue, come also important challenges and opportunities. But above all, and if I had to reduce it down to just one word, I think I would speak simply of broadening the narrative of Irish history in scope, in sources, and in locations. I'll give a few quick examples of what I mean by this. One of my biggest headaches when coming to this topic from a Latin American perspective was the issue of the differing and sometimes competing chronologies. Whereas in the case of Ireland, it's the immediate aftermath of the United Irish Rebellion of 1798 and the passage of the Act of Union that tend to mark the watershed in the literature respecting the Age of Revolutions. The independence wars in Spanish America took place throughout the 1810s and a good part of the 1820s. Yet when we dive into the archives, these words display a constant entanglement, whether it's through Irish patriots in the 1780s adopting indigenous South American pen names and commenting on the Tupac Amaru rebellion in Peru, op-eds in South American newspapers weighing in on the Irish campaign for Catholic emancipation in the early 1810s, or United Irish exiles in the US corresponding passionately with Spanish American patriots about their shared Republican credentials. Something similar happens when it comes to analyzing in depth the historical actors, the people involved in these connections. Only through a wider approach that accounts for long distance entanglements can we bring to the fore the circuits and diasporic networks connecting the hundreds of Irish individuals who took up arms against the Spanish Empire in the Americas to the Irish communities who took up on the other side of the conflict, those formed by the select members of the Irish emigrate community in the Spanish monarchy, who through group solidarity and long-established kinship practices had risen to positions of power as colonial officials, soldiers, or clerics in the Hispanic New World. By contrast, seeing these groups in isolation, as often has been the case, offers a truly distorted picture. The challenges of this global term come in many forms, not least the sacrificing at times of depth for breadth, Perhaps my main bone of contention, however, is the lack of mutual awareness from historians in both Latin America and Ireland. Focusing on the Irish side, I find that the study of Irish experience of imperial collaboration and resistance, in spite of the inherent transnational nature of empire itself, still falls almost exclusively on territories that form part of the British Empire. I think it is clear that the canon of Irish empire and diaspora studies is still excessively Anglophone. And I tend to blame the cultural imperialism of the English language for this, but I would love to hear other or your own views. Another challenge or a potential pitfall which concerns me when speaking about Ireland and the global is the issue of influence. It seems to me that an important part in flawed notions of Irish exceptionalism in the 20th century relies on tropes about how Ireland was a precursor to emancipation processes, for example, in India. But if we really believe that the global turn can be a tool against Eurocentrism, we need to stress that exchanges were never unidirectional nor preordained, and do our best not to slip into these type of influence model. To close, I want to stress the opportunities that the global turn offers in what regards the interactions between Ireland and Latin America, whether it's to focus on Irish engagement with abolitionism, republicanism, white settler colonialism, or extractive imperialism. Archives in Spain and Latin America contain a wealth of materials in Spanish, allowing us to historize the Irish Age of Revolutions from the bottom up. Local judicial and church repositories in South America are almost virgin ground in this sense. And the opportunities in terms of gender and environmental history, just to point two out, or to follow the money of Hispano-Irish slavers seem at this point almost endless. I am convinced that some of the most exciting work in Irish diaspora history is being done right now by historians who don't think of themselves, or perhaps even of the subjects of their work, as pertaining to Irish history. Taking this perspective on implies making Irish historical research much less monolingual and developing much closer collaboration with Latin American scholars. I think that the way forward, always bearing in mind the contingency of these processes, has to be to search much more actively for the submerged voices of the non-white, non-male, non-monolingual Irish. I truly believe that this is the best way of revisiting the history of the Irish diaspora in Latin America and the Caribbean, broadening prevailing conceptions of Irishness, and raising questions about who is visible in Irish history and who is not. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Jose, and thanks to everyone. Fantastic papers, so many ideas. We were all, I mean, each of us scribbling down, I'm sure all of us, so many stimulating thoughts from everything that's been said. We have a couple of questions lining up. I'm just going to give people a couple of moments to maybe add additional questions there, and I've used my position as chair to ask a question myself. It's a theme that emerged, I think, in something that everybody more or less said and addressed this question in one way or another. This question of kind of the reflexivity, I suppose, of doing this kind of research, be that in terms of, Sophie, what you were saying about the job market, about our own mobilities as scholars. Of course, I think out of the 6 or 5 plus myself, none of us have sort of been in the same place. We've all had to move around, or indeed, you know, the archival practice. I suppose the question I wanted to ask you all, a specific kind of subsection of that notion of reflexivity, is actually about teaching. And how you find you know, developing this, I guess, this research practice, this global, you know, placing Ireland in global context, or for variants of that in the process of your teaching, which of course is something that comes back to inform and shape our outlook. So just in the order of the speakers, I might, you know, open that up, and if anyone wants to come in there, come right in.
Well, I haven't taught in a while, so, but I suppose that, I mean, when we're talking about power relations, the decisions to sort of put modules like that into university syllabi and curriculums and whatnot would lie with the people as the heads of the department. I mean, you could integrate a certain amount of the global into your own teaching within the class, of course. I mean, but I think from my own experience, the readings are already set out for you. I mean, as a sort of early career teacher anyway, I haven't reached the stage where I could devise my own modules. But I suppose in terms of like the question I was trying to interrogate about mixing or moving the sort of global history into something material, maybe broadening the sort of decolonial links out into public history or something away from the academy. You could talk about that in terms of why would these global or these decolonial sort of ideas, how could we spread them into, you know, into the public sphere, into schools and whatnot. Again, the African scholars have taught a lot about this. There was even an announcement by the South African government recently that they would look at these sort of decolonial ideas and the teaching and promotion of African languages and sort of South African history and national symbols. You know, so those are some of the things that I would think about, is how can you link actual the global turn in history and learn from the other countries that do this, and then link that into the public sphere and link it into actually building institutions like Gaelscoileanna, where and you know there are sort of issues with Gaelscoileanna in terms of, you know, they might be promoting a sort of just the language, and they're not talking about linking this into a wider decolonial framework. So how do you sort of bring that into those schools? I haven't thought about what the question you're answering in my own teaching, to be honest, but I'm interested in linking the academy with decolonial thought on the outside and expanding that globally.
Thanks very much, Kerron. Sophie?
I do a lot of teaching, and I've done it in quite a few places. I think this is my 6th university in 5 years. And I think that, I mean, I get Irish history into most things that I speak about, for better or for worse. But I do think there's quite good ways. There's also good ways of selling yourself as a kind of, like at Northumbria, I was lecturer in US and British world history from 1800, which is quite a broad scope. But there was ways of, like, I taught the US Civil War, and we had a week where we talked about different ethnic regiments and things like that, nuns on the battlefield and things. I did a particularly interesting module at Leicester where it was on race and ethnicity, but I spoke about the 19th and 20th century Irish diaspora, and a colleague of mine spoke about race and ethnicity and the construction of those things in medieval Europe. So we were able to kind of compare across time periods as well as spaces. There's also things like, so I taught a module on the Irish Revolution, but I used letters between Tom and Kathleen Clarke from when they were living in New York. Well, when Tom was living in New York and writing back to Kathleen in Dublin, and students really connected with that. So giving them the sources that show that these people were living in kind of international circles and working across and between them is just something that I've really enjoyed doing. And I do think there's lots of ways of like slipping it in, to be honest, even if you're not completely in control of the overall module.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Do you want to say something, Aoife?
It's kind of, I guess, similar enough to what Sophie was saying about slipping in Irish history. Like I did a lecture on like it was a historiographic lecture on empires. So I talked about like informal empire, and I looked at like empires of humanitarianism, which wasn't necessarily about Irish. It was about kind of like British missionaries. But then I also looked at the like Irish Episcopal Empire and kind of discussed how that's a sort of informal empire. So that was kind of a way, which I think is kind of like a helpful way of looking at empire and kind of challenging the idea of empires as like a particular form of like kind of state governance that comes with kind of like certain kind of characteristics like military involvement and things like that. So I think that's kind of helpful. And actually at the moment I've just started working on a project called like Imagining Futures Through Unarchived Past, which is not an Irish history thing. So again, what Sophie was saying, kind of adapting myself to different things, but some of the stuff I'm doing is working with master's students in Tanzania who are like working on sites of commemoration and memory and working with school children. And we've had some really interesting discussions about the Folklore Commission and those the like oral history projects where the school children wrote like, yeah, they basically took down the oral history from their parents and grandparents and talking about sort of intergenerational memory and commemoration. So I think that, like, in terms of questions about archives and yeah, also like looking at Ireland in a decolonial sphere, I think there's like loads of really helpful ways that we can kind of like compare the Irish experience to other countries like in the global south. So that's my, yeah, I think my experience of that can be like a, yeah, definitely like a strength rather than a weakness, or that if you, yeah.
Thanks very much, Aoife. Do Kenneth or Jose want to come in on that question about kind of reflexivity in teaching?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. I have a lot of freedom in what I can develop and teach at my university, fortunately. And so when I teach Irish history, I teach a global history of Ireland and try to put just as much of every event that I can in the history of Ireland into the global perspective. And then here in the upper Midwest, we have a lot of Irish fests. And as a way to counter some of the pattyism that I see here, I'm invited to give talks, and I try to give a global perspective there to try and push back against some of the more essentialized views of the Irish. And then one other thing is I'm involved with Advanced Placement World History. It's a college level exam given at the high school level. I've been part of the test writing. And so I've done a lot to try and get Irish questions and Irish content into those exams. And I was finally successful. There was one document-based question that had a quote from De Valera. So that was a major win on a very minor scale. So there's been some stuff done here, but it's really the sort of think globally, act locally type of approach.
Thanks very much. And Jose, do you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, I feel a bit as the outlier in this, but I'll just, my experience, I was lucky enough to be able to teach some seminars on an Irish diaspora history or introduction to Irish diaspora history here in Salamanca. But there was a very important requirement there, which was to frame the seminar in a discussion on the presence of foreign communities in the Spanish monarchy, in a composite monarchy, so not studied in isolation. So this is, I think that's what students found very rich in a sense, was to compare it to the Genovese or Portuguese or Swiss, other communities, and how these communities interact. At the same time, it was a bit necessary to do a bit of a process of demystifying Irish history at some points, you know. Usually when the first question, well, okay, what's Irish diaspora? Obviously the US was the first thing, but the second thing most students mentioned was Che Guevara, Ernesto Guevara Lynch. And so there were, you know, all these assumed anti-colonial solidarities, which we had to like put aside to be speaking about the 18th century. Or so that on one side. And then in Galway, I was also lucky to be able to develop a module on the age of revolutions in the Hispanic world. And there what I faced was one of the problems that I was speaking about, although it also became a bit of a challenge and an opportunity, which was that it had to be very much based on primary sources, but I had to find translated primary sources because all the reading list had to be, or not all of it, but the main reading list had to be in English, which poses a new set of questions, especially about, you know, in my training for my PhD, on Latin American independence, conceptual history was one of the major areas. So how do we translate revolution? How do we translate, and all of this, teaching this in translation was a very interesting moment. And also, and I'll finish here, but I have sort of a question for my Irish-based colleagues, because for us here, one of the big inroads into Latin American history or into global takes on history are Erasmus students, so visiting foreign European students, but we also get students lots from Latin America. So I wonder if in Ireland maybe there's a way of developing modules which set Irish history within a wider context, and that could be attractive to students who come for a semester or whatever and enroll. So I don't know, that's sort of a suggestion or an idea off the top of my head. So thanks again. Sorry.
Thanks very much, Jose. Yeah, we have a couple of questions now in the chat. So in no particular order, I think I might start with just Niamh McGowan. Niamh asks, first of all, thanks to the fantastic presentations. And she says, I wonder if the panelists could comment on whether the kinds of potential research outlined ultimately require a collaborative approach rather than the quote unquote traditional practice of the solo scholar and the single author publication in the discipline, particularly in terms of moving towards forward with kind of multilingual, intersectional or interdisciplinary work. So if anyone wants to come in on that, please do.
For myself, go ahead, Jose. No, go ahead, Jose.
Absolutely. I think it's the only way in many senses. I mean, also for many of the reasons Sophie mentioned of mobility, of precariousness, or especially for early career researchers. I mean, I know there's some interesting things that I want to look at in Bolivia or in Chile, but I don't think I'm going to get round to doing that anytime soon. So there's a lot of, and I think any piece of written work would benefit from collaboration, integration. So I think in the humanities we're not all that used to that, and there's also all the issue of rankings and the need for publications and getting an established position. And at least here in Spain, co-authored publications count less than a single authored publication and things like that. So, but yeah, I think for me that is definitely the way forward.
Thanks very much, Jose. Anyone else want to come in on that question of collaborative? Yeah.
Yeah, just to build off of what Jose is saying is, I would love to do that. I'm very much limited by my languages, my ability to travel. I think there's ripe opportunities to build off what I'm doing if other people see it as valuable. And I fully recognize the limitations of what I'm doing. And somewhat arrogantly, I believe that what I'm doing could be a starting point, and I would hope to see others add to it. For example, I've communicated just a tiny bit with a professor in Ghana named, interestingly enough, Devalera Bachwe. I keep beating the drum for Devalera today. I'm sorry about that, but it's grandson of Kwame Nkrumah. So I think that would be really interesting.
Okay, great. Yeah, Sophie?
If there's just time, I think, I mean, there's huge amounts of opportunities, and I really think we should be collaborating more. I think funding schemes are also kind of designed that way at the moment to encourage collaboration. So it's kind of in our own interests as well as, well, the institution's interests as well as our own interests. But I do think as we kind of branch away from the traditional written archive as well, or at least the traditionally monolingual archive of institutions, working with people from other disciplines is just, it's necessary, and it's also lovely and enjoyable most of the time. So yes.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Okay, if anyone else doesn't want to come in on that particular point, we might move on to another question. We have quite a few here now. There's a question, Kevin posted a question. He said the panelists address inequality, several of them, but essential question are contemporary crisis in various, which is an essential question, our contemporary crisis. Does the special issue, which several of us worked on, or indeed kind of the broader work represented, consider another central question, which is the environment, in many ways an inherently transnational and global question? If so, what is the global turn in this field? I don't know if anyone would like to come in on that question.
Well, it's something that I spoke about recently at a sort of a political education school, and I sort of placed the deforestation of Ireland within the colonial context and placed that sort of side by side with the language shift, or the sort of demise of the language, and you can see that there's a sort of a very strong correspondence there with the Forestry Acts and the sort of emphasis on Irish wood for the British Navy and so forth. I mean, other countries were deforested for, you know, economic and farming reasons, but I think it was more intense in Ireland because of colonialism. And funnily enough, the Gael School, and some of them would have been involved in some environmental campaigns. Like one of the Gael School I looked at in Ballymun, in the working class area of Dublin, the people who founded that were very instrumental in saving a place called Santry Wood, which is still there today. And maybe there's sort of potential I think there should be potential to sort of view, the revitalization of the language as a sort of rewilding process. There's you see a lot of posts on Twitter now about how can we rewild parts of Ireland. It's going on in Scotland already in some of the overgrazed highlands and so forth. There is a sort of turn in terms of Irish language and environmental things. There was a book by Michael Cronin, and the name escapes me, a couple of years ago, published on Monk and Magan, who people may know from the T.G. Cahir and the telly and so forth. He sort of looks at place and how place and language are linked, and that ties into a sort of global things that people will be more familiar with in America, water defenders and land defenders, and how Indigenous rights are bound up with language rights and so forth, and place and the right to land. And there's good stuff going on in Colombia on that front. I believe some of the FARC guerrillas who've decommissioned have established these communes where they have cooperatives and they have language classes and sort of environmental projects all intermingled. So yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, Kerron. I know Sophie's going to come in there. There's a question from Dan right after Sophie speaks. So go ahead, Sophie.
Oh, I'm happy to leave it, but I suppose I was just going to say, environment is understood in so many different ways. If we talk about environmental history, I think the importance of kind of climate change and things and the shifting climate in relation to, say, humanitarian work like Aoife was talking about, and that Andrew Newby is working on, for example, and how those kind of intersections. I think that is a really interesting way for kind of Irish history in a global sense to go.
Thanks very much, Sophie. That's fascinating. So yeah, Dan Mulhall has made a couple of points, and in particular a question for Kerron. He asked Kerron, how would you view the two other developments of the Irish language in the past 20 years into your broader analysis, when he's referring to the setting up of T.G. Cahir and granting official status to the Irish language in the EU in 2005, which has opened up opportunities for Irish speakers which weren't available in the past. So Kerron, if you might address that.
Yeah, there's certainly positive developments. T.G. Cahir has been instrumental in changing sort of the wider perceptions of the public towards the language and the status of the language in the EU, which the Irish government actually derogated for nearly 50 years when, upon accession to the EEC, was finally granted in the last few years, and there's translators working away there in Brussels. And that obviously gives a greater status to the language, and that's important, although there's not enough translators being trained to filter through. But those are sort of, I would see them as not superficial, but sort of things of the superstructure. We need to look at the sort of base material problems, especially like the decline of the Gaeltacht and what can be done in terms of that. And when we talk about colonisation, there's still a massive imbalance in terms of power and democracy and funding to the West in general, not just the Gaeltacht, but the centralisation of power and economy in Dublin, and how can that be decentralised? Rural Ireland is dying, not just the Gaeltacht and the Irish-speaking areas, but there's a move towards urbanisation because this suits the planners, the sort of planners, and some of the EU environmental law comes in there as well in the Gaeltacht. But I mean, I would focus on the base material, the density of speakers in traditional speaking heartlands, although those are two positive developments, but the material needs to be key, I think.
Thanks very much, Kerron. Yeah, we've had some kind of affirmative comments as well coming in from Tim McMahon and Patrick Jordan as well, emphasizing, I think, a point that several of you have made, an emphasis on the institutional context and certain incentives and disincentives there, which can become very real obstacles for pursuing this kind of historiographical practice and teaching. I have another question from Kevin on. Hold on now, let me get it up. About insights on how the category of class which is a kind of a classic category, but also in many ways an underworked one in Irish historiography, how this has functioned in rural settings in the Irish context. And perhaps there is several kind of different ways in which we can perceive that and see that in global terms, bearing in mind that, of course, global urbanization is a relatively recent modern phenomenon. Would anyone like to comment on that question of rural class?
I can speak because this is something that I found really interesting in my research, was like looking at like the urban classes in Dublin who were like during the famine were kind of like going to department stores, and like they were like building commuter trains. And I just find that really striking that like there was, while the famine and like lots of the Queen's universities were opening at this time, so there are these manifestations of like urban consumer culture, and lots of these people had more in common in terms of their lifestyles with people who would have been in like London and Paris. And I think that element of class in the famine is rarely, I think it's becoming more discussed. But like something that I found really striking as well was working on the Catholic Church, is that there was collections held in Ireland, like raising money for Pope Pius, who had been who had to kind of flee from Rome because there was a revolution in Rome. But I just found it really shocking that there were people in Ireland who had enough disposable income to raise money for this fund that was then being sent out of Ireland. So I think that question of looking at like transnational class, like, and looking at how people in Ireland had, this kind of middle class often had more in common with not necessarily their Irish compatriots, but maybe people in Paris or London.
Thanks very much, Aoife. I suppose we should probably close things down now, as we're going to come to the end in about a minute or two. I'd like to thank everybody. Thank the panelists for joining us. Thanks to Glucksman Ireland House for hosting this event. Thanks for all of those in the attendance and the audience who asked questions. In particular, thank you to my colleagues here at Ireland House, Caroline Heafy, Mary Elizabeth Lennon, David Hall, and of course the director, Kevin Kenny, for your support in putting this event on. There will be more events in the programme, and we're moving to hopefully eventually to in-person events, but there will be more Zoom events, so stay tuned. And thank you all again. I'm speaking for myself, I've thoroughly enjoyed this and learned an awful lot as well. So thanks very much, and we'll leave it there.